August 14th, 1943. A field hospital, 3 miles behind the front lines in Sicily. The Mediterranean sun beat down on canvas tents stretched over muddy ground. Inside, Captain James Sullivan, a 24-year-old medic from Ohio, knelt beside a 19-year-old private, whose name he didn't know. The boy's uniform was soaked through with blood. Shrapnel from a German 88 had torn through his abdomen and left thigh. His pulse was barely there. His skin had gone the color of old newspaper. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Sullivan reached for a small tin can. Inside sat 2 glass bottles. One contained yellowish powder, the other distilled water. He mixed them together. 300 seconds. That's how long the reconstitution took. 5 minutes between a dying soldier and something that might save him. The boy's eyes rolled back. His breathing came in shallow gasps. Sullivan inserted the needle. Plasma flowed into collapsed veins. Within 2 minutes, color returned to the boy's face. His pulse steadied. His eyes focused. He would live to see his mother again. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The miracle Sullivan witnessed that August afternoon was not magic. It was chemistry. It was innovation born from desperation. And it was the culmination of a battle fought not on European battlefields, but in American laboratories, blood banks, and hospital corridors. A battle against time, against prejudice, and against the fundamental limits of what human blood could do when severed from the body. This is the story of how one man's illegal method transformed military medicine, how a technique denounced by the establishment saved nearly 1 million American lives, how the father of the blood bank revolutionized warfare itself, even as his own country told him his blood wasn't good enough. The story begins not in 1943, but 5 years earlier, in a laboratory at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital in New York City, 1938. Charles Richard Drew stood before a refrigerator filled with glass bottles containing human blood. The blood was a week old. By every established medical principle, it should have been worthless, dangerous even. Blood stored for more than 2 days developed bacterial contamination. The red cells broke down. Transfusing old blood could kill a patient faster than leaving him untreated. But Drew's bottles contained something different. Not whole blood. Plasma. The liquid portion of blood, separated from the red cells that carried oxygen. And it was still usable, still stable, still capable of saving lives. Drew was 33 years old, the son of a carpet layer and a schoolteacher from Washington, D.C. He'd earned his medical degree from McGill University in Montreal after American medical schools, with their informal quotas made clear that a black student, no matter how brilliant, would find limited opportunities. At McGill, he'd excelled, captain of the track team, winner of the annual prize in neuroanatomy, graduated second in his class of 137. Now, at Columbia, he was a Rockefeller Fellow pursuing a Doctor of Medical Science degree, one of the first African Americans to do so. His dissertation topic, Banked Blood, a study in blood preservation, would become the foundation for modern blood banking. But in 1938, blood banking was considered a theoretical curiosity, an academic exercise. Blood transfusions happened at bedside, donor to recipient, in real time. The idea of storing blood for later use seemed impossible. The chemistry was the enemy. Whole blood began deteriorating the moment it left the body. Red cells were fragile. Without oxygen circulation, they ruptured, released hemoglobin, created toxic compounds. Even with anticoagulants like sodium citrate, refrigerated whole blood remained usable for perhaps 72 hours, maybe 4 days if you were lucky and careful. The logistics were insurmountable. Each transfusion required blood typing, matching donors to recipients. The 4 blood types, A, B, A, and O, created a puzzle that made large-scale blood storage impractical. Type A blood couldn't go to Type B patients. Type B couldn't go to Type A. Only Type O blood, the universal donor, could be given to anyone. but only 8% of the population had O-negative blood. Drew's innovation was elegant in its simplicity. Separate the plasma from the red blood cells. Plasma contained no red cells, therefore no blood typing. Plasma from any donor could be given to any patient. No matching required, no deadly reactions. Universal compatibility. But the brilliance went deeper. Plasma was the body's shock absorber. When a soldier lost blood, the immediate danger wasn't always oxygen depletion. It was shock. Shock occurred when blood volume dropped so low that the heart couldn't maintain blood pressure. Without pressure, blood couldn't circulate. Organs began shutting down. The brain, the kidneys, the heart itself. Plasma prevented shock. Its proteins, especially albumin, created osmotic pressure that pulled fluid from surrounding tissues into blood vessels. Expanded blood volume, restored circulation, bought time for the body to manufacture new red cells or for whole blood transfusions to be administered at better-equipped hospitals. Drew proved plasma could be refrigerated for a week, perhaps longer. He demonstrated techniques for extraction that maintained sterility. He developed protocols for testing, storage, and administration. His work transformed blood from a perishable commodity, available only at bedside, into a bankable resource that could be stockpiled, transported, and deployed wherever needed. His dissertation, submitted in June 1940, was a masterwork of clinical observation and practical chemistry. It laid out the entire blueprint for blood banking: collection procedures, anticoagulant ratios, refrigeration temperatures, sterility protocols, shelf life calculations, everything needed to move from theoretical possibility to practical implementation. The timing was prophetic. The dissertation was accepted on June 14, 1940. 2 weeks earlier, on May 26, the British Expeditionary Force had begun its desperate evacuation from Dunkirk. 338,000 men pulled from French beaches as Germany's blitzkrieg crushed Allied defences. The war in Europe was reaching a crescendo. Britain stood alone, and Britain was bleeding. The Blitz began in September 1940. German bombers pounded London nightly. Civilians died by the thousands. Hospitals overflowed with wounded. The injured didn't always die from their wounds. They died from shock, from blood loss, from the simple mathematical reality that Britain didn't have enough blood to treat the casualties. A cablegram arrived at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital in August 1940. It came from Dr. John Beattie, Drew's former professor who had returned to London. The message was urgent. Britain needed 5,000 vials of dried plasma. Immediately, with another 5,000 to follow 3 weeks later. The request was staggering. No one had ever attempted to collect, process, and ship blood products on such a scale. There were no established protocols, no infrastructure, no supply chains. The entire American blood banking system consisted of a handful of hospital-based programs collecting a few dozen pints per week. The Blood Transfusion Association of New York City took up the challenge. They needed someone who understood both the science and the logistics, someone who could transform laboratory procedures into industrial processes, someone who could organize hospitals, recruit donors, coordinate collection, oversee processing, and ensure that every vial shipped to Britain met medical standards. They chose Charles Drew. He was appointed medical supervisor of the Blood for Britain project. His official title was Medical Director of the 1st Plasma Division for Blood Transfusion. At 35 years old, he was about to organize the world's first large-scale blood collection program. Drew's challenge was immense. Blood donation in 1940 was rare. Most Americans had never donated blood. There was no culture of voluntary donation, no understanding of blood banking, no infrastructure for collection. Hospitals didn't have blood centers. They had small laboratory spaces where technicians drew blood from individual donors for immediate transfusion to specific patients. Drew had to build everything from scratch. He established collection centers at 9 New York City hospitals, developed standardized equipment, created training protocols for staff, designed recruitment campaigns to bring in donors, invented the concept of the Mobile Blood Collection Unit, blood mobiles, trucks with refrigeration equipment that could serve as donation centers. The technical challenges were equally daunting. Fresh plasma had to be extracted from whole blood within hours of collection. The process required centrifugation to separate plasma from red cells, sterile filtration to remove any contaminants, testing for diseases like syphilis, packaging in sealed containers, refrigeration for shipping. But the British needed dried plasma, not liquid. Liquid plasma required continuous refrigeration. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic. Convoys took weeks to cross. Refrigeration couldn't be guaranteed. One broken cold chain and the entire shipment would be worthless. Dried plasma solved the problem. By freeze-drying plasma into powder form, it could be stored at room temperature, indefinitely. No refrigeration required. It could survive torpedo attacks, ship sinkings, rough transport. Medics in the field could reconstitute it simply by adding distilled water, 5 minutes from powder to life-saving transfusion. The pharmaceutical company Sharp and Dome had experimental freeze-drying equipment. Drew coordinated with them, refined the process, tested the stability, ensured the dried plasma retained its proteins, its osmotic properties, its ability to expand blood volume and prevent shock. The Blood for Britain program operated from August 1940 through January 1941, 5 months. In that time, Drew's organization collected blood from 15,000 American donors, processed it into liquid plasma, shipped 5,000 liters to Britain, every vial tested, every vial sterile, every vial capable of saving lives. The impact was immediate. British hospitals used American plasma to treat casualties from the Blitz. Soldiers wounded in North Africa, sailors pulled from burning ships. The survival rates spoke for themselves. Plasma worked. Shock could be prevented. Lives could be saved, even when whole blood wasn't available. Drew's success with Blood for Britain provided proof of concept. Large-scale blood collection was possible. Plasma was effective. The logistics could work. And America was about to need that knowledge desperately. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. America entered the war. Suddenly, the theoretical became urgent. The United States would send millions of men overseas. Those men would be wounded. They would need blood. They would need plasma. They would need it in quantities that made Blood for Britain look like a pilot program. In January 1942, the American Red Cross and the National Research Council established the National Blood Donor Service. Its mission was to collect blood for American military use, to build a nationwide network of blood collection centers, to process millions of donations into dried plasma, to stockpile enough plasma to treat American casualties on every front of a global war. Charles Drew was the obvious choice to lead it. He was appointed director of the American Red Cross Blood Bank, assistant director of blood procurement for the National Research Council, in charge of blood collection for both the U.S. Army and Navy. His responsibilities were staggering: organize blood centers across the nation, develop standardized procedures, train thousands of staff, recruit millions of donors, oversee pharmaceutical companies processing plasma, ensure quality control, manage logistics. Drew approached the task with characteristic precision. He established regional blood centers in major cities, coordinated with the Red Cross chapters to recruit donors, developed a national donor registry, created standardized equipment packages, wrote detailed procedure manuals, set strict quality standards, built the infrastructure that would collect 13 million pints of blood by war's end. But as Drew built the national blood banking system, a shadow fell across his work, a policy that had no basis in science, no justification in medicine, a policy rooted purely in prejudice and fear. In April 1941, the U.S. military issued a directive. Blood plasma collected for military use would be segregated by race. Blood from white donors would be kept separate from blood from black donors. The plasma derived from white blood would be labeled for white recipients. Plasma from black blood would be labeled for black recipients. The policy was explicit in its reasoning. For reasons which are not biologically convincing, but which are commonly recognized as psychologically important in America, It is not deemed advisable to collect and mix Caucasian and Negro blood indiscriminately for later administration to members of the military forces. The American Red Cross, despite initial resistance, agreed to enforce the policy. Beginning in April 1941, they would accept blood from black donors, but that blood would be segregated, processed separately, labeled separately. The vials would carry notations, Negro blood. So white soldiers wouldn't receive plasma from black donors. The irony was crushing. Charles Drew, the architect of the blood banking system, couldn't donate to his own program. His blood, the blood of the man who had pioneered plasma preservation, who had organized Blood for Britain, who was directing the national blood collection effort, was deemed unfit for white soldiers. From a scientific standpoint, the policy was absurd. Blood has no race. Plasma has no race. The proteins in plasma are identical across all human populations. There are 4 blood types, A, B, AB, and O. Those types exist in all races. A white person with type A blood has the exact same blood chemistry as a black person with type A blood. Plasma is even more universal. Because it contains no red blood cells, there's no blood typing needed at all. Plasma from any donor can be given to any recipient. Race is medically meaningless in plasma transfusion. The policy had zero scientific basis. Drew knew this. He'd written his dissertation on blood preservation. He understood blood chemistry better than almost anyone in America. He'd proven plasma universality. He'd organized Blood for Britain without segregation, and it had worked perfectly. The segregation policy was medical nonsense enforced for political reasons. But Drew was in an impossible position. He'd spent his entire career fighting against racial barriers. He'd attended McGill because American medical schools discriminated. He'd excelled at every level, proving that brilliance had no color. Now he was directing a national program where official policy declared his blood inferior. He could have remained silent, kept his head down, focused on the work. The blood banking system needed him. Thousands of lives depended on the program he was building. Speaking out risked everything: his position, his influence, his ability to continue the work. Drew spoke out anyway. He wrote letters, he gave interviews, he argued before military and Red Cross officials. He presented the science. Blood has no race. Plasma from black donors is identical to plasma from white donors. The segregation policy was medically unnecessary, logistically burdensome, and ethically wrong. Soldiers would die unnecessarily while waiting for same-race blood that had no medical meaning. In a letter to the Federal Labor Standards Association in 1944, Drew wrote, "It was a bad mistake for 3 reasons. 1. No official department of the federal government should willfully humiliate its citizens. 2. There is no scientific basis for the order. And 3. They need the blood." The policy didn't change. The military insisted on segregation. The Red Cross complied. Black donors could contribute, but their blood would be kept separate, labeled, marked as different, as lesser. Drew resigned. He stepped down from his position as director of the American Red Cross Blood Bank in 1942. He accepted a position as chair of surgery at Howard University, a professor at a historically black college, training black surgeons, mentoring black students, building a legacy that didn't require him to enforce policies he knew were wrong. His resignation was quiet. He didn't make a public spectacle, didn't attack the Red Cross, simply walked away from the program he'd built, the program that would go on to collect 13 million pints of blood, process over 10 million pints into dried plasma, save hundreds of thousands of American lives. The blood banking system Drew created operated throughout the war. 8 pharmaceutical companies processed donated blood into dried plasma packages. Each package contained 2 bottles, one with dried plasma, one with distilled water, packaged in tin cans filled with nitrogen, sealed under vacuum, designed to withstand combat conditions. The packages were shipped to every theatre of war: Europe, North Africa, the Pacific, loaded onto ships, dropped by parachute, carried in ambulances, distributed to field hospitals, battalion aid stations, even frontline medics. Anywhere a soldier might be wounded, plasma was there. The protocol was simple. A medic would open the tin can, remove the 2 bottles, pour the distilled water into the dried plasma, wait 5 minutes for reconstitution, insert an intravenous needle, begin transfusion, no blood typing required, no cross-matching, no waiting for compatible donors, just plasma and time. The survival statistics told the story. In World War I, approximately 30% of wounded soldiers died. In World War II, that number dropped to 4%. 96 out of every 100 wounded soldiers survived. The single largest factor in that improvement was plasma. Surgeon General Norman T. Kirk addressed the American Medical Association in June 1943. He listed 3 reasons for the unprecedented survival rates. First, plasma. The foremost lifesaver is plasma, the dried blood extract which millions of Americans have been giving the Red Cross for nearly 2 years. Plasma stops shock and bleeding, and without that many men would have died before they could have reached medical care. Second, improved surgery. Field hospitals positioned close to front lines, rapid evacuation, skilled surgical teams, better wound management. Third, sulfur drugs, antibiotics that prevented infection. Wounds that would have festered and killed in previous wars could now be controlled. But plasma came first. Because plasma kept soldiers alive long enough to reach surgery, long enough to receive antibiotics, long enough to be evacuated to better equipped hospitals. The stories from the field were remarkable. A chaplain on the USS Minneapolis, struck by a Japanese torpedo, suffered critical burns. He was wrapped in gauze, given plasma, evacuated to Tulagi. Doctors gave him little hope. The plasma kept him alive. He recovered. A private in Sicily, shrapnel wounds to the abdomen. Medic administered plasma while under fire. The private survived long enough to reach a field hospital. Surgery, full recovery. An officer on the USS Northampton picked up from the ocean after his ship sank. Hypothermic. In shock, plasma restored his circulation. He lived. The plasma used in these transfusions came from American donors, collected at Red Cross centers, processed by pharmaceutical companies, shipped across oceans, all following the protocols Charles Drew had established, the system he'd built, the infrastructure he'd designed. But the plasma was segregated. White donors separate from black donors, as if blood carried memory of skin color, as if proteins knew prejudice. Drew spent the rest of his career at Howard University, training surgeons. In 1943, he became the first African-American examiner on the American Board of Surgery. He couldn't join the American Medical Association's Washington, D.C. chapter because they only accepted white members, but he was elected to the International College of Surgeons in 1946. He won the Spingarn Medal from the NAACP in 1944 for his contributions to plasma research and blood banking. The medal recognized the highest and noblest achievement by an African American in the preceding year. His achievement had saved countless lives. His protest had changed nothing about military policy. The war ended in August 1945. The blood banking system had collected over 13 million pints of blood, processed 10 million pints into dried plasma. The plasma had been used at Normandy, at the Battle of the Bulge, in the Pacific Island campaigns. Everywhere American soldiers fought and bled. The survival rates remained unprecedented. 96% of wounded soldiers who reached medical care survived. The golden hour, the critical, first 60 minutes after injury, became less golden and more survivable because plasma could be administered immediately in aid stations, in ambulances, on beaches during amphibious assaults. The dried plasma packages proved remarkably robust. They withstood extreme temperatures, could be dropped by parachute without breaking, survived months in jungle humidity and desert heat. The freeze-drying process Drew had helped perfect created a product that required no special storage, just tin cans, just powder waiting to save lives. By war's end, pharmaceutical companies had processed over 569,000 units of albumin, a purified protein fraction separated from plasma by Dr. Edwin Cohn at Harvard. Albumin was even more concentrated than plasma. more effective for treating severe shock. It became the standard treatment for burn victims, head injuries, and critical blood loss. The methods Cohn used to fractionate plasma, the Cohn process, separated plasma into 5 distinct protein fractions. Fraction 5 contained albumin. Other fractions contained gamma globulins, useful for immune therapy. Fibrinogen, essential for blood clotting. Each fraction could be isolated, purified, and used therapeutically. The entire plasma fractionation industry grew from wartime necessity. The techniques developed by Drew for collection and by Cohn for fractionation became the foundation for modern blood banking. The infrastructure built during the war persisted after it. Blood banks became permanent fixtures in hospitals. Donation became a civic duty. The Red Cross continued collecting blood for civilian use. But the segregation policy remained in place until 1950. Even after the war ended, even after hundreds of thousands of soldiers had been saved by plasma that worked identically, regardless of donor race, the policy was finally ended, but not before Drew's death. On April 1, 1950, Drew was traveling to Tuskegee, Alabama, to deliver a lecture. He was with 3 residents from Howard University. All 4 men were black. Drew fell asleep while driving. The car ran off the road and rolled over. Drew was thrown from the vehicle. He suffered catastrophic injuries, a nearly severed leg, massive chest trauma, a broken neck. He was taken to Alamance General Hospital, a segregated white hospital. Contrary to myths that would later circulate, the doctors there treated him immediately. They did everything possible. But his injuries were too severe, his blood loss too great. He died at 45 years old. The man who had revolutionized blood banking, who had saved hundreds of thousands of lives, died from injuries that might have been survivable with the techniques he'd helped pioneer. The irony was not lost on the medical community. Drew's life's work had been about saving lives through blood. His death was from blood loss. His legacy lived on. The blood banking methods he established remain the standard. Modern blood collection follows protocols Drew helped create. Plasma fractionation uses techniques refined during the war. The mobile blood donation concept, blood mobiles, remains the primary method for blood collection. The numbers speak to his impact. During World War II, over 13 million Americans donated blood. Over 10 million units of dried plasma were sent to military theaters. The plasma saved an estimated 700,000 American lives, lives that would have been lost to shock, to blood loss, to the simple absence of treatment in those critical first hours after injury. Drew's resignation in protest of blood segregation made no headlines, changed no policies during his lifetime, but it stood as testament. Sometimes doing what's right means walking away from what you've built. Sometimes the most powerful statement is refusal to participate in injustice, even when that injustice doesn't directly harm you, even when your participation might save lives. The question Drew faced was impossible. Do you continue working within an unjust system because the work saves lives, or do you step away because participating validates the injustice? Drew chose principle. He built the system, then he left it, let others run it, returned to training surgeons, to teaching, to building a different kind of legacy. The plasma packages that arrived on Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, carried no names, no racial designations, just serial numbers, production dates, instructions for reconstitution. To the medics crouched in shell craters, treating soldiers torn apart by German machine gun fire, the plasma's origin was irrelevant. What mattered was the yellowish liquid flowing into collapsed veins, the steadying pulse. The return of consciousness. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. 23-year-old Corporal Robert Murphy from Boston lay in the sand, his left leg nearly severed below the knee. Shrapnel from an 88mm shell had shredded his thigh. Blood soaked through the sand beneath him, turning it dark and wet. His face had gone grey, his breathing shallow. Medic Thomas Henderson pulled a tin can from his pack. Inside, 2 bottles. The ritual he'd performed dozens of times since landing 3 hours earlier. Pour the distilled water into the dried plasma. Wait. The powder dissolved slowly, turning water into the thick, protein-rich solution that would keep Murphy alive long enough to reach the field hospital 2 miles inland. Henderson inserted the needle. Plasma flowed. Within minutes, Murphy's pulse strengthened, his eyes focused. He would survive, would lose the leg, but survive, would return to Boston, marry his sweetheart, raise 3 children, live to see his grandchildren. The plasma that saved Murphy's life had been donated by someone in Philadelphia, processed by a pharmaceutical company in Detroit, packaged in New Jersey, shipped across the Atlantic, loaded onto an LST landing craft, carried through surf under enemy fire, all to be reconstituted in a shell crater on a French beach by a medic who had been a grocery clerk 15 months earlier. The logistics were staggering. By D-Day, the American military medical system had stockpiled over 1 million units of dried plasma, distributed across England, prepared for the invasion. Each unit represented one donation, one American civilian who had walked into a Red Cross center, rolled up their sleeve, spent an hour giving blood. The donors never met the soldiers they saved, never knew if their blood went to Normandy or Italy or the Pacific, never learned that their plasma, dried and packaged and shipped across the world, was the difference between a soldier bleeding out in 20 minutes or surviving long enough for surgery. The scale of the blood donation effort transformed American culture. Before the war, blood donation was rare. Medical students occasionally gave blood for research. Hospital staff might donate in emergencies, but the concept of voluntary mass blood donation didn't exist. The Red Cross changed that. Posters appeared everywhere. Give blood, save lives, images of soldiers in combat, appeals to patriotism, radio shows promoted blood drives, celebrities donated publicly. The message was clear. If you couldn't fight overseas, you could still contribute. Your blood could save an American life. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. By 1944, blood donation centers operated in cities across the nation. Red Cross volunteers organized drives at factories, offices, universities. Mobile bloodmobiles traveled to rural areas. The response was overwhelming. Workers donated on lunch breaks. Housewives brought neighbors. Entire communities organized donation days. The donated blood flowed into a vast collection network. Refrigerated, tested for diseases, processed by centrifugation to separate plasma from red cells. The red cells were often discarded. The plasma was the prize. Shipped to pharmaceutical laboratories. 8 commercial firms held contracts: Park Davis, Eli Lilly, Sharp and Dome, Squibb, Lederle, Cutter, Highland, Abbott. Each company had developed freeze-drying equipment, large vacuum chambers where plasma was frozen to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, then subjected to vacuum. The ice sublimated directly to vapor, leaving behind dried protein. The process took hours, required precise temperature control, generated powder that looked like yellow dust but contained all the proteins that made plasma work. The powder was packaged in glass bottles, sealed under vacuum, packed in tin cans with distilled water bottles. The cans were labeled, inspected, tested. 1 unit in every 5,000 was opened and tested for sterility, protein content, pyrogenicity. The quality control was obsessive. 1 contaminated batch could kill soldiers. The testing delays meant plasma took months to reach the battlefield after donation, but it also meant every unit was safe. The dried plasma packages had to survive everything: loading onto ships, Atlantic crossings through storms and submarine attacks, storage in tropical heat and Arctic cold, transport in trucks over bombed roads, drops by parachute into forward positions, rough handling by exhausted medics working under fire. The packaging was engineered for abuse. Tin cans protected glass bottles. Nitrogen atmosphere prevented oxidation. Vacuum seals ensured sterility. The bottles were thick glass, resistant to breakage. The cans were cushioned with paper pulp. The entire package could withstand drops from 10 feet, Temperature swings from -40 to +120 degrees Fahrenheit, rough transport over any terrain. Testing was brutal. Packages were frozen solid, baked in ovens, dropped, and repeatedly, shipped in trucks over rough test courses, subjected to gunfire, placed under artillery during firing practice. The goal was to find the breaking point, to ensure that anything that reached the battlefield would survive battlefield conditions. Most did. The breakage rate in the field was less than 2%, remarkable given the conditions. Packages that had crossed the Atlantic, been loaded onto landing craft, carried through surf, dragged through mud, and stuffed into medic packs under machine gun fire still contained intact bottles with viable plasma. The medics who administered the plasma received minimal training. Most were not medical professionals. They were infantry soldiers given basic medical instruction, how to apply tourniquets, how to dress wounds, how to administer plasma. The plasma administration was taught as a simple procedure: open can, mix bottles, insert needle, monitor patient. But simple procedures under fire became complex. Medics worked in shell craters, in driving rain, under sniper fire. Their hands shook from adrenaline. The wounded screamed. Blood made everything slippery. Finding veins in soldiers whose blood pressure had dropped to shock levels required skill developed through repetition. Many medics learned by doing. The first transfusion was awkward. By the 10th, it was routine. The plasma worked, regardless of the medic's skill level. Even poorly administered plasma helped. Even plasma given too slowly or through damaged veins expanded blood volume, reduced shock, bought time. The margin for error was generous. Plasma didn't require blood typing, didn't need perfect sterile technique beyond basic field sanitation, didn't demand precise dosing. Pour it in, wait, watch the soldier's pulse strengthen. The statistics from field hospitals told the story. Soldiers who received plasma within the first hour after injury had survival rates above 95%. Those who received plasma within 3 hours survived at 92%. Even soldiers who didn't receive plasma until 6 or 8 hours after injury, whose wounds had festered, who had spent hours in shock, still showed improved survival when plasma was finally administered. The comparison to World War I was stark. In the First World War, mortality from shock and blood loss approached 50%. Soldiers wounded in no man's land often bled out before rescue. Those who reached field hospitals arrived in such severe shock that treatment was futile. Blood transfusions were direct, donor to recipient, requiring matched blood types and taking hours to arrange. Most shock victims died before transfusion could be attempted. World War II changed everything. Plasma at the point of injury. Immediate treatment. No waiting for blood typing. No searching for compatible donors. Just powder and water and 5 minutes. The mortality rate from shock dropped to single digits. Soldiers who would have died in 1917 lived in 1944. The British had learned this lesson early. In North Africa, British medical units used plasma extensively. American surgeons observed and learned. When American forces landed in North Africa in November 1942, they carried plasma, used it liberally, documented survival rates that exceeded expectations. Sicily and Italy reinforced the lesson. Plasma worked. Frontline medics became believers. They saw soldiers in extremis, pulse barely palpable, consciousness fading, revive after plasma transfusion. Watched grey skin regain colour, felt thready pulses strengthen, heard screaming soldiers go quiet as shock receded and pain became manageable. The Pacific Theatre presented unique challenges: tropical heat, humidity, jungle conditions where refrigeration was impossible, plasma packages stored for months in temperatures exceeding 100 degrees, yet they remained viable. Testing showed that dried plasma could tolerate extreme heat if kept dry. The tin cans protected against moisture. The powder inside remained stable. Island warfare created casualty patterns different from Europe. More burns from naval combat, more blast injuries from naval artillery, more tropical diseases complicating wounds. Plasma remained effective for all of them. Burns especially benefited. Burn victims lose massive amounts of plasma through damaged skin. Replacing that plasma prevented shock, maintained blood pressure, allowed time for wound care. The Battle of Tarawa in November 1943 demonstrated plasma's value. The three-day battle for a tiny Pacific atoll produced over 3,000 American casualties. Marines fought in water, on beaches, in bunkers. Medics administered plasma while wading through surf, crouched behind cover, working in coral caves. The plasma packages, waterproof in their tin cans, survived immersion. The dried powder reconstituted normally even after exposure to saltwater spray. Back in the United States, the blood collection effort continued. By mid-1944, the Red Cross was collecting over 100,000 pints of blood monthly. The pharmaceutical companies processed it into plasma as fast as it arrived. The military demanded more, always more. Every battle created casualties. Every casualty needed plasma. The donor base expanded. Initially, the Red Cross had been hesitant to accept blood from African Americans. Then, they accepted it but segregated it. By 1944, the segregation continued, but the need was so great that blood from black donors constituted a significant percentage of total collections. The plasma from that blood, labeled Negro plasma, saved white soldiers' lives. The irony was lost on no one except apparently the military bureaucrats who enforced the policy. Charles Drew, working at Howard University, trained black surgeons who would serve in segregated military units. Many of his students went to war, treated casualties in Italy, France, the Pacific, used plasma that their professor had pioneered, worked within a system that told them their blood was different, even as they transfused plasma from black donors into white soldiers without adverse effects. The scientific evidence was overwhelming. Race had no bearing on blood compatibility. Plasma from any donor worked in any recipient. The segregation policy was pure politics, yet it persisted. The military refused to change, the Red Cross complied, and Drew, from his position at Howard, continued to speak against it, continued to argue that science, not prejudice, should guide medical policy. In January 1944, Drew wrote his letter to the Labour Standards Association. The letter was measured, precise. It laid out the scientific case. Blood has no race. The policy humiliated citizens. And critically, soldiers died while waiting for same-race blood that had no medical meaning. The letter changed nothing, but it stood as testament. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Allied advance created unprecedented demand. The D-Day invasion in June 1944. The breakout from Normandy in July. The race across France in August. Every advance meant casualties. Every casualty needed plasma. The supply system strained to keep up. Field hospitals operated close behind front lines. Some within artillery range. They performed surgery in tents, operated by gaslight when generators failed, worked through air raids, treated hundreds of wounded daily. Every patient received plasma upon arrival. Some received multiple units. The plasma kept them stable during surgery, prevented shock from surgical blood loss, maintained blood pressure through long operations. The surgical teams developed protocols. Plasma first, always plasma first, before surgery, during surgery, after surgery. The plasma bought time for blood typing if whole blood transfusion was needed, bought time for complex operations, bought time for evacuation to rear hospitals if the surgical team couldn't handle the injury. Whole blood eventually joined plasma in forward hospitals. By late 1943, the military established blood banks in theatre. Blood collected from rear echelon troops, type O only. Universal donor blood that could be given to anyone. Refrigerated in truck-mounted units, delivered fresh to field hospitals. But whole blood was fragile, lasted days even with refrigeration, required cold chain maintenance, broke down during transport. Plasma remained the frontline standard. Plasma lasted indefinitely, required no refrigeration, could be stockpiled in forward positions, was always available. The German military watched American plasma use with interest. They developed their own blood products, but German logistics couldn't match American production. American pharmaceutical companies produced millions of units annually. German production measured in tens of thousands. American supply lines delivered plasma to frontline medics. German supply lines barely kept ammunition moving. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 tested the American medical system. German forces broke through Allied lines, surrounded American units, created thousands of casualties in brutal winter conditions. The plasma supply system held. Medics in surrounded Bastogne administered plasma to wounded paratroopers. The C-47 transport planes that dropped ammunition also dropped plasma. The tin cans, cushioned in parachute drops, landed intact. By war's end in May 1945, the numbers were staggering. 13 million pints of blood donated, 10 million units of dried plasma produced, over 500,000 units of albumin fractionated, distributed to every theatre, used by every military branch, the Army, the Navy, the Marines, the Air Corps. Even the Coast Guard carried plasma. The survival statistics validated everything. 96 out of every 100 wounded soldiers who reached medical treatment survived. The 4% who died generally had injuries incompatible with life: massive head trauma, severed major arteries, multiple organ destruction, injuries that no medical technology of 1945 could treat. But the 96% who survived included soldiers with horrific wounds, soldiers who had lost limbs, suffered abdominal injuries, sustained massive burns, men who in previous wars would have died from shock before treatment. In World War II, they received plasma within minutes, survived the golden hour, reached surgery, lived. The military medical establishment recognized plasma's contribution. Surgeon General Norman Kirk called it the foremost lifesaver. Medical journals published studies documenting survival rates. Combat surgeons wrote papers praising plasma's effectiveness. The consensus was unanimous. Plasma worked. Plasma saved lives. Plasma had revolutionized battlefield medicine. Yet the man who had made it possible, who had organized Blood for Britain, who had built the national blood banking infrastructure, who had designed the collection protocols, remained unacknowledged by the military establishment. Charles Drew's name appeared in medical journals. His peers recognized his contributions, but official military histories barely mentioned him. The blood banking system he created was described as if it had sprung fully formed from committees and bureaucrats. The segregation policy that Drew had protested remained until 1950, 5 years after the war ended, 5 years after millions of transfusions had proven that plasma worked identically, regardless of donor race. The policy was finally dropped not because of scientific evidence, but because it had become administratively burdensome and publicly embarrassing. His death in April 1950, 6 months before the policy change, meant he never knew that his protest had eventually contributed to progress. His letters, his arguments, his resignation, they had mattered. Not immediately, not during the war, but eventually. The irony of Drew's death haunted the medical community. The man who had saved hundreds of thousands through blood banking died from blood loss. Urban legends spread that he'd been denied treatment at a white hospital, that he'd bled to death while racist doctors refused to help. The legends were false. The doctors at Alamance General had treated him immediately, had done everything possible, but the myths persisted because they captured a larger truth. Drew had fought his entire career against barriers erected by racism. His death became a symbol of that struggle. The reality was more complex. Drew had succeeded brilliantly, had pioneered blood banking, had organized mass blood collection, had built systems that saved lives. But he'd succeeded within a system that told him his blood was inferior, that denied him membership in professional organizations because of his race, that made him fight for every achievement. At Howard University, Drew's legacy lived on. The surgeons he trained spread across the country, joined hospital staffs, trained more surgeons, built careers. Many became leaders in their fields. All carried Drew's teachings, his emphasis on excellence, his insistence on rigorous science, his belief that medicine should serve all people regardless of race. The blood banking system Drew built evolved after the war. The Red Cross continued collecting blood, but now for civilian use. Hospitals established blood banks, community blood drives became routine. The wartime emergency system transformed into permanent infrastructure. The pharmaceutical companies that had processed plasma during the war continued fractionating blood products. The cone process for separating plasma proteins became standard. Albumin, gamma globulin, fibrinogen, factor VIII for hemophiliacs, factor IX for Christmas disease, all derived from donated plasma, all saving lives. Modern blood banking would be unrecognizable without Drew's contributions. The protocols for collection, the techniques for testing, the methods for storage, the concept of mobile collection units, the idea that blood could be banked like money, deposited by donors and withdrawn by patients, all trace back to Drew's work in 1938 through 1942. The dried plasma that saved so many lives in World War II eventually became obsolete. By the Korean War, fresh frozen plasma replaced dried plasma for combat use. Better preservation techniques, more reliable cold chains, helicopters for rapid evacuation meant whole blood could reach wounded soldiers within hours. The need for room temperature, stable dried plasma decreased, but the principle remained. Early plasma administration saves lives. Modern combat medicine still emphasizes plasma. Freeze-dried plasma has made a comeback for special operations forces operating in remote areas. The technology has improved. Viral inactivation techniques ensure safety. But the fundamental idea, plasma in powder form ready for field use, is Drew's legacy. The statistics from modern conflicts validate what Drew proved in 1940. In Iraq and Afghanistan, American forces achieved survival rates exceeding 90%. The wounded who reached medical care almost all survived. The key was early plasma administration. Medics carried plasma, administered it immediately, just as they had on Omaha Beach, just as Drew had envisioned. The hook that opened this story, the medic in Sicily mixing dried plasma in August 1943, represents millions of similar moments. Millions of soldiers treated, millions of families who welcomed home wounded men who would have died in previous wars. Millions of lives that continued because plasma stopped shock long enough for medicine to work. Charles Drew's contribution was the foundation. He didn't invent plasma. He didn't discover blood typing. He didn't develop freeze-drying. But he organized the systems that made plasma practical. That transformed a laboratory technique into a battlefield tool. That connected American civilians rolling up their sleeves in Red Cross centers to combat medics working under fire in Sicily, Normandy, Iwo Jima. The title of this story calls Drew's method illegal. That's not quite accurate. The method wasn't illegal. It was revolutionary. It challenged established medical practices. It proposed storing blood, which doctors said was impossible. It suggested using plasma instead of whole blood, which surgeons said was inadequate. It relied on mass voluntary donation, which administrators said was impractical. What was illegal, or at least scientifically criminal, was the segregation policy. The policy that said Drew's blood was different, that plasma carried racial identity, that soldiers needed same-race plasma. That policy had no basis in science. It was illegal by the standards of scientific truth. Drew's protest against it was his finest moment, not his technical achievements, not his organizational brilliance, his willingness to walk away rather than participate in injustice. The 48 hours mentioned in the title refers to the critical window after severe injury. Modern trauma care calls it the golden hour. But in World War II, the window was longer. A soldier wounded in combat might take hours to reach a field hospital, might spend a day or more in evacuation. The plasma administered in the first minutes or hours kept him alive through that 48-hour window until definitive surgical care was possible. 97% in the title is slight hyperbole. The actual survival rate was 96%, but the principle holds. Nearly every wounded soldier who received medical treatment survived. The single biggest factor was plasma that prevented shock. That maintained blood volume. That bought time. The real story isn't about one pharmacist, though the title suggests that framing. Charles Drew was a surgeon, not a pharmacist. But he was one man. One man who saw a problem and solved it, who recognized that blood could be banked and proved it, who organized systems when war made those systems essential, who protested injustice even when protest cost him his position. Drew's story is American medicine's story. Progress achieved through individual brilliance and systematic organization. Lives saved through technology and logistics. Triumph, complicated by the persistent presence of racism that told brilliant black scientists their blood was inferior while using their discoveries to save white soldiers. The packages of dried plasma that reached battlefields carried no acknowledgement of their origin, no label saying, "Created by Charles Drew." Just serial numbers and dates. But every package represented his vision, his techniques, his systems, his insistence that blood could save lives if we organized the collection, processing, and distribution correctly. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.